At 6:14 a.m. on October 9th, 1976, the desert was still cold enough for breath to fog inside the turret as a line of T-72 tanks lay buried in the sand, only their turrets and long 125mm guns peeking above the dunes. Sergeant Viktor Sokolov sat half-submerged in his hull-down firing pit, feeling grains of sand fall from the turret roof each time the wind shifted. He had spent the entire night listening to nothing but static, the distant hum of generators, and the groaning of metal cooling under the desert air. But Viktor wasn't afraid. None of them were. They believed their newly delivered T-72 seconds Soviet engineering at its peak were untouchable from long range. Their senior advisors had spent weeks telling them the same message. No Western fire control system can touch you beyond 1,200 meters. The Abrams? Overhyped, overweight, a gas turbine toy. Dawn crept across the horizon, stretching long shadows over each dug-in tank. The crews exchanged quiet radio jokes about how the Americans would never find them, let alone hit them. The doctrine was simple. Dig deep, show only the turret. Wait for the enemy to close the distance, then overwhelm them. Viktor adjusted the gun sight, tapping sand out of the edge of the optic. Through the glass he saw nothing, just heat haze and an ocean of dunes. He felt confident, protected, invisible, but far beyond his sightline, something else was watching. The M1 Abrams, freshly field-tested, experimental, and rumored by Soviet intelligence to be technically interesting but tactically irrelevant, was already tracking faint thermal signatures across the cooling desert floor. The Abrams didn't need silhouettes. It didn't need daylight. It needed only a whisper of heat. Viktor leaned forward. A faint glimmer, maybe sunlight hitting a dune, flashed for half a second. He blinked, adjusted focus. It was gone. Silence settled again across the pits. Then the horizon flashed white. A sabot round traveling nearly a mile per second sliced across the desert and slammed into the forward pit, obliterating the first T-72 inches a blast of sand and steel. Viktor froze. That tank was over 1,500 meters away, well beyond what he had been told the Abrams could hit. Before he could even shout a warning, a second flash. Another impact. Another T-72 gone. The pits they trusted to protect them were now traps fixing their hulls in place, limiting their depression angles, preventing them from escaping, as the Abrams fired again with mechanical precision. In that moment, Viktor understood the truth. They hadn't mocked the Abrams because it was weak. They mocked it because they had no idea what it was truly capable of. The sun climbed higher over the desert on that October morning in 1976, revealing a battlefield shaped more by assumptions than by actual intelligence. The T-72 seconds remained buried in their carefully constructed pits, each one aligned along a shallow ridgeline that Soviet advisors claimed would create a perfect overlapping field of fire. Viktor knew the layout by heart, because he had helped dig those positions under the belief that concealment alone could negate any technological advantage the Americans possessed. The sand-packed berm around his turret felt solid and protective, yet he could not shake the memory of the sudden blast that had consumed the forward tank. Far behind the horizon, the M1 Abrams crews had already begun establishing their own tactical rhythm, relying on a fire control system generations ahead of anything Viktor had ever seen. Unlike the T-72 crews, who depended on optical rangefinders vulnerable to glare and distortion, the Americans trusted an integrated suite of sensors that turned the desert's shifting temperatures into precise targeting data. Each Abrams moved in a loose wedge formation designed to maintain wide sight lines, ensuring that every tank could independently detect and engage enemies long before traditional doctrine predicted contact. The vast desert between both forces created an illusion of safety that Viktor and his men clung to, unaware that the enemy had been trained specifically to exploit open terrain. Soviet instructors had insisted that American tank crews would struggle to track targets at extended distances due to heat haze disrupting visual cues, but those assumptions ignored the capabilities of thermal imaging. The Abrams did not need clean visibility or high-contrast silhouettes. It needed only the faint thermal outline produced by metal cooling unevenly in the early morning air. Viktor scanned the horizon again, fighting the frustration of seeing nothing but shimmering dunes stretching endlessly in every direction. The desert air wavered in thin waves of heat that distorted depth and distance, leaving him with the uneasy feeling of watching an empty stage moments before an unseen actor stepped into view. He knew that T-72 doctrine emphasized ambush tactics, especially when hull-down positions reduced frontal exposure by nearly half. Yet the earlier impact had shown that concealment alone could not outpace a weapon system designed to render such tactics obsolete. On the American side, tank commanders adjusted their ranges with deliberate confidence, each operator trusting the precise feedback of stabilized sights, unaffected by vibration or terrain. Instead of waiting to visually confirm targets, they used electronic range-finding to lock in distances that Soviet manuals considered impossible to maintain under combat stress. These systems allowed the Abrams to fire accurately while moving, something Viktor's instructors had claimed no tank could truly accomplish without sacrificing hit probability. Viktor finally heard the faint rumble of engines rolling across distant dunes, a low vibration that blended with the wind until it felt like the desert itself was shifting. His loader muttered a quick range estimate, but Viktor dismissed it, knowing that guesses meant nothing when facing an enemy capable of firing with mathematical certainty. The second destroyed tank, still burning in the pit ahead, proved that their assumptions about American limitations no longer held any truth. As he prepared to relay updated bearings, Viktor realized that the battlefield he had trained for did not exist. The doctrines he relied upon had been written for a world where visibility controlled engagements, where distance protected defenders, and where concealment saved lives. Yet in that moment, he understood that the Americans were not fighting the same war. They were fighting a war defined by information, precision, and technology, one in which the desert offered no hiding place and no second chances. Viktor steadied his breathing as he tried to reconcile the silence inside his turret with the violence unfolding just beyond his sight. He had been taught that the T-72s' optical systems would give him clear visual superiority at mid-range, yet the desert's shifting glare now made every distant shape blur into meaningless waves of heat. The manuals never mentioned how easily sunlit sand could blind a periscope, nor how quickly a shallow firing pit could become a trap when the enemy held the advantage of superior targeting technology. He watched his gunner struggle to obtain a stable range, adjusting the reticle again and again while muttering curses about fluctuating contrast. The doctrine promised that hull-down tactics would protect their frontal armor by minimizing the exposed surface area, but nobody explained that the restricted elevation angles inside these pits would cripple their ability to respond once the enemy attacked from unexpected distances. Viktor felt the turret's limited arc fight against him, turning sluggishly as though the sand itself resisted any attempt to reorient toward the incoming threat. Inside the T-72, each crewman felt the pressure mount as the seconds dragged on without a clear target, underscoring a flaw their instructors never addressed: the dependence on visual confirmation before engagement. Soviet doctrine insisted that firing without identification was reckless and wasteful, yet it failed to account for a scenario where the enemy could already see, track, and measure them long before any silhouette became visible through traditional optics. This gap between theoretical training and battlefield reality widened with every distant explosion echoing across the dunes. Viktor remembered the emphasis placed on rapid autoloader cycles during training, where they practiced loading shells in smooth mechanical rhythm inside clean, controlled environments. Those drills never simulated the cramped angle restrictions caused by hull-down pits, nor the difficulty of adjusting firing solutions while half the tank remained immobile beneath several tons of sand. The autoloader might still be fast, but its speed meant little when the gun itself required constant micro-corrections to counteract terrain that refused to cooperate. His mind drifted to the assumptions they all carried that American tanks relied too heavily on bulky electronics, prone to failure in harsh climates, and that the turbine engines would generate heat signatures so large they would give away positions instantly. Yet the real problem was far more humiliating. The Abrams electronics were not hindrances but decisive advantages, enabling it to calculate trajectories with cold precision, while the T-72 crews struggled merely to maintain visual clarity. The very conditions they believed would cripple the Americans now crippled them instead. Viktor realized the fatal flaw was not the tank beneath him, though it had limitations he could no longer ignore. The true flaw was the doctrine shaping their decisions, built on outdated assumptions about how modern armored warfare operated. Their entire defensive layout, these carefully dug pits, these overlapping arcs of fire, these confident range estimates had been designed for a world where the first to see was the first to shoot. But now they faced an enemy who did not need to see in the traditional sense, an enemy whose technology allowed engagement long before any human eye registered a threat. As he stared at the shimmering horizon, Viktor felt the weight of this realization tighten in his chest. The manuals had promised clarity, control, and predictable engagement ranges, yet the battlefield offered none of those comforts. Instead, it revealed a truth his training never acknowledged. If doctrine could not adapt to technology, then doctrine would become a liability, and no amount of sand or steel could protect a crew from a weapon designed to erase distance altogether. Viktor tried to calm his racing thoughts, but the burning wreck ahead reminded him that every assumption carried a price measured in human lives. He could still see faint sparks rising from the shattered turret of the lead T-72, each flicker marking the end of a crew who had trusted the same doctrines he once believed were unshakable. The desert wind carried the smell of scorched fuel across the dunes, mixing with the fine dust that drifted lazily through the slits of his optics, creating a haze that further obscured his already fragile sense of awareness. He remembered the faces of the men in that tank, men he had shared rations and exhausted nights of maintenance with, men who joked about how the Americans would never dare challenge a fortified Soviet-style defensive line. Their laughter now echoed through his thoughts, as a grim reminder of how quickly confidence could transform into tragedy when doctrine failed to keep pace with technological change. The manuals never explained how to process the sudden loss of comrades, nor how to continue operating when the battlefield stripped away the illusion of superiority. A static burst crackled across the radio, followed by an abrupt and frantic voice reporting movement that no one could clearly identify. Another pit went silent before Viktor could even adjust his bearings, replaced by a dull thud that vibrated through the sand beneath his boots. He imagined the crew inside that tank, desperately trying to rotate their turret or adjust their gun depression, only to realize they were already being bracketed by an enemy who had calculated their position before they had even raised their optics. He recalled training stories of previous engagements where tanks survived because the enemy missed their initial shots, granting precious seconds to reposition or return fire. Yet those stories felt meaningless now, because the Abrams did not miss, and the T-72 crews were not being challenged, they were being systematically erased. Each destroyed pit represented not just a tactical setback, but the collapse of a defensive design built on assumptions that the enemy would fight within the boundaries they expected. Viktor thought of Lieutenant Mikhail Levin, a young officer who had once insisted that their hull-down line would turn any approaching enemy into easy targets. He had repeated the Soviet advisor's claims with unwavering conviction, arguing that no Western tank could acquire reliable firing solutions through shimmering desert heat. Now his tank lay half-buried in flames, its turret resting at an awkward angle as smoke curled into the sky like a silent accusation. The desert had swallowed his confidence as quickly as it had swallowed his crew. Through the smoke, Viktor caught glimpses of flickering shadows, the distorted outlines of sand dunes shifting in the wind, reminding him that even the terrain seemed to distort truth and perception. The battlefield no longer resembled the controlled diagrams from their training textbooks. Instead, it had become an unpredictable landscape where each destroyed tank carved a deeper wound in their collective morale. The reality of warfare had stripped away every comforting illusion, leaving only the stark understanding that their defensive line was dying faster than they could comprehend. With each loss, the psychological pressure tightened around Viktor's crew like an invisible vice, making every decision heavier and every moment sharper. They had been taught that courage came from discipline and preparation, yet nothing in their training prepared them for the crushing sensation of watching their defensive formation disintegrate before they could even fire a meaningful shot. The silence that followed each explosion felt more devastating than the blast itself, because it signified another crew extinguished without resistance. As Viktor steadied his hands on the controls, he realized that the battlefield's true cruelty lay not in the violence itself, but in the gradual erosion of hope. Every destroyed tank was a story cut short, a lesson their doctrine refused to teach, and a reminder that the greatest danger was not the enemy's firepower, but their own unwillingness to question outdated beliefs. The stakes were no longer measured in strategic positions or lines on a map. They were measured in the lives already lost, and the ones still waiting to be claimed by an unseen and unrelenting enemy. Viktor felt the weight of every lost tank pressing against his thoughts, as he searched for a rational explanation that could reconcile the devastation with the doctrine he had been taught to trust. He considered the possibility that their range estimates were flawed, yet the precision of the impacts suggested a level of accuracy that could not be attributed to mere luck or coincidence. The radio operators continued relaying scattered reports about flashes on the horizon, but none of them could pinpoint the exact source, leaving the crews trapped in a fog of uncertainty that grew thicker with every passing minute. He remembered the countless lectures from Soviet advisors who emphasized that Western tanks relied too heavily on complex electronics, vulnerable to dust, heat, and vibration. Those instructors insisted that the T-72's rugged simplicity would outperform any sophisticated system Once environmental conditions degraded visibility and sensor performance, yet the unfolding battle demonstrated the opposite, because the Abrams seemed entirely unfazed by the desert's harshness, and its accuracy suggested a targeting method unaffected by glare or atmospheric distortion. The realization forced Viktor to confront a thought he had long dismissed as propaganda. Perhaps American technology was not a fragile liability, but a decisive advantage. His gunner cursed quietly as he attempted another adjustment to the rangefinder, frustrated by the inconsistent readings produced by the oscillating heat waves. The optical system they relied upon, designed for controlled conditions and predictable light, now betrayed them with relentless flickering that made stable targeting nearly impossible. Viktor recognized that this was a structural flaw embedded deep within their doctrine, an overconfidence in optical performance under idealized assumptions rather than real battlefield conditions. The pitiful results unfolding around them were not caused by a single mistake, but by an entire framework of training that failed to acknowledge its own limitations. He thought back to the maintenance crews, who often warned about minor calibration issues in the rangefinder assemblies, issues dismissed by commanders as trivial, because they did not significantly impact performance during peacetime exercises. These warnings now echoed ominously, because even slight calibration errors became catastrophic when combined with terrain distortions and the enemy's superior ability to detect heat signatures from long distances. The T-72 crews had been conditioned to trust a system that faltered precisely when their survival depended on its reliability, and Viktor felt betrayed by the complacency embedded in the chain of command. The instructor manuals also emphasized the strength of the T-72's autoloader as a key advantage, yet they never discussed the ergonomic limitations imposed by hull-down positions. Viktor realized that the cramped angle of their turret inside these pits restricted the smooth operation of the autoloader, forcing it to compensate for uneven alignment and resulting in subtle delays that compounded under stress. The idea that their primary advantage could transform into a hindrance under real-world conditions was something no training scenario had ever acknowledged, exposing another blind spot in the doctrine shaping their expectations. Even more troubling was the rigid hierarchy that discouraged questioning established procedures, creating an environment where concerns about visibility, terrain alignment, or optical distortion were routinely dismissed as excuses rather than legitimate tactical considerations. Viktor recalled proposing minor adjustments to their pit angles during preparation, only to be told that adherence to the manual was more important than improvisation. Now, as explosions consumed their defensive line, he realized how deadly such rigidity could be when facing an enemy capable of adapting faster than the doctrine permitted. He began to understand that their predicament was not merely the result of inferior equipment, but the culmination of systemic flaws, outdated assumptions, rigid training, and an unwavering faith in doctrine that had not evolved to counter modern threats. The Abrams did not simply outshoot them, it exploited every weakness in their preparation, shining a harsh light on the vulnerabilities hidden beneath the surface of their confidence. Viktor felt a deep sense of frustration as he grasped that their defensive strategy had never accounted for an opponent who could render distance meaningless and concealment irrelevant. As he tightened his grip on the controls, Viktor finally accepted the painful truth. Their doctrine had taught them how to operate their tanks, but it had never taught them how to survive a battlefield reshaped by technology they were never trained to understand. Viktor felt the turret tremble as another distant shockwave rippled through the sand, signaling that the Abrams had already claimed yet another victim along their failing line. The realization that their defensive formation was collapsing forced him to act, even though every instinct warned him that the battlefield no longer followed any familiar rules. He ordered the gunner to widen their search arc, hoping to catch the faintest trace of movement across the shimmering horizon before the enemy locked onto them next. The gunner struggled to steady the crosshairs, fighting the distortion created by radiating heat waves that bent the horizon into an unstable blur. Each adjustment felt increasingly futile, yet Viktor pushed him to persist, knowing that remaining passive would guarantee their destruction in the next exchange. He could sense the tension building within the cramped turret as every man braced for an attack they could neither see nor predict, their breaths shallow and synchronized with the hum of machinery surrounding them. Suddenly, a faint flash appeared far beyond their usual engagement expectations, a brief glint that seemed almost accidental in its subtlety. Viktor seized the moment and instructed the gunner to hold position, hoping the flicker represented an Abrams silhouette momentarily, catching the early sunlight at a fatal angle. The loader readied another shell with mechanical urgency, his hands trembling, as he forced the autoloader to operate smoothly, despite the difficult angle imposed by the pit's restrictive design. Viktor called for range, and the gunner responded with a number that immediately unsettled everyone inside the turret because it placed the target well beyond the doctrinal limits they had been told were reliable. Nevertheless, Viktor ordered the shot, not out of confidence but out of desperation to challenge an enemy who had already demonstrated overwhelming reach. The gun fired with a sharp recoil that sent dust cascading from the pit walls, momentarily blinding the crew as they struggled to track the projectile's distant impact zone. The round struck the sand far short of the anticipated target, exploding harmlessly in a cloud of dust that only emphasized their inability to match the Americans' precision. Viktor knew they had now revealed their position completely, providing the Abrams with the final piece of information needed to eliminate them with calculated certainty. He ordered the turret to reorient, but the limited traverse available from their hull-down position fought against them, forcing the gunner to make slow, painful corrections that left the tank exposed for critical seconds. The radio erupted with overlapping voices as nearby crews reported taking fire from multiple angles, each transmission drowned beneath a rising sense of panic. Every call for assistance ended abruptly, replaced only by static and the distant thunder of sabot rounds striking steel. Viktor realized the battlefield had become a one-sided kill zone where the Americans dictated every engagement, using speed, distance, and precision to dismantle Soviet-trained positions with ruthless efficiency. Another flash ignited across the dunes, unmistakable this time, as the Abrams delivered a second pinpoint shot directly toward their pit. Viktor braced himself as the incoming round whistled across the open desert, its trajectory so precise it seemed guided by an invisible hand rather than human judgment. The impact struck just short of their position, blasting sand against the turret with such force that the entire tank shuddered as if gripped by an earthquake. The loader cried out as debris rattled through the compartment, but Viktor shouted for them to stay focused, knowing the next shot would not miss. He urged the gunner to attempt one last adjustment, even though the sight picture remained hopelessly distorted by smoke, heat, and dust funneling down into their pit. The mechanical whine of the stabilizer struggled to keep pace, its oscillations revealing a desperate attempt to align with a target already locked onto them with deadly clarity. In that suspended moment, Viktor understood that their fate hinged on a single impossible act, firing accurately at a foe who observed them with technological senses far beyond human limitations. Their attempt to stand and fight had become a symbolic gesture against a battlefield transformed by precision and information, a battlefield where bravery alone could not compensate for outdated doctrine. As he steadied his grip on the controls, he felt the crushing weight of inevitability closing in, signaling that the Americans were about to deliver the final, decisive strike. The explosion that followed seemed to swallow the desert in a single blinding flash, leaving Viktor momentarily unsure whether the impact had struck his tank or another unfortunate crew farther down the line. The blast rolled over them like a collapsing wave of sand and heat, forcing each man inside the turret to brace against the vibrating steel that now felt more fragile than they ever imagined. When the dust slowly drifted away from the pit's edge, Viktor realized with grim relief that they had survived the initial strike, though the trembling in his hands reminded him how close they had come to being erased entirely. He forced himself to scan the horizon again, even though his vision blurred from the lingering shock that rattled his composure. The dunes ahead, once orderly and familiar, now appeared torn and uneven, scarred by multiple impacts that revealed the brutal accuracy of the Abrams gunners. Smoke rose from at least 3 positions where T-72 seconds had previously stood ready, marking the silent graves of crews who never fired a meaningful shot. The battlefield had transformed so violently that Viktor struggled to recognize the defensive line they had spent days preparing. The radio crackled weakly with intermittent signals, each transmission fragmented by static and panic as the surviving crews attempted to regroup. Viktor listened closely, trying to determine whether any tank still maintained a coherent firing capability, but every message dissolved into half-finished reports and abrupt silences. The complete collapse of communication revealed a catastrophic failure of coordination, reinforcing the unbearable truth that their entire formation had ceased functioning as a unified force. What remained were scattered survivors, clinging to isolated pits, each waiting for the next unseen strike. Inside the turret, the loader wiped sand from his face with a trembling hand, his expression betraying the growing dread that neither training nor discipline could suppress. He whispered a question. Viktor chose not to answer, because acknowledging their predicament would only worsen the fear already tightening around their thoughts. The gunner continued fighting the controls, though his movements had slowed, weighed down by the realization that their efforts were unlikely to alter the outcome now unfolding. Their tank felt like a stranded relic, surrounded by the ruins of a doctrine that no longer held relevance. The desert wind carried the faint metallic scent of burning ammunition, mixed with the sharper tang of smoldering rubber and heated armor plating. Viktor recognized these smells from training demonstrations, but those controlled scenarios never captured the overwhelming presence of genuine destruction. The smoke rose in heavy columns that blurred the horizon and masked the shifting shapes of dunes, turning the battlefield into a landscape consumed by both physical and psychological haze. Every new plume of smoke marked another layer of their defensive line, collapsing into silence. Viktor forced himself to consider the operational consequences, though each thought pressed deeper into a sense of hopeless inevitability. Their line, once designed to delay an enemy advance, had become irrelevant after the Abrams demonstrated its ability to dismantle them from extreme distance. The very concept of a defensive screen had evaporated, replaced by an expanding void where tanks once anchored the Soviet-style strategy. Without those anchors, the broader formation behind them would face the same threat without warning or preparation. The loader finally broke the suffocating silence by asking whether they should attempt to reverse out of the pit, his voice cracking under the weight of uncertainty. Viktor hesitated, knowing the maneuver would expose their vulnerable lower hull, while offering little chance of reaching safer ground before the Abrams recalculated their position. The pit had become both a shelter and a tomb, protecting them from small arms fire, while trapping them within the narrow arc of a doomed defensive design. Every choice now carried consequences measured not in tactical value but in seconds before detection. As the rising smoke thickened and the horizon dimmed, Viktor realized that the aftermath of the initial strikes was not an interlude, but a prelude to their inevitable destruction. The battlefield offered no opportunity for recovery, no chance to reorganize, and no illusions left to comfort the surviving crews. The silence between distant impacts grew heavier than the explosions themselves, signaling that the Abrams were recalibrating for the next precise shot. Viktor gripped the turret controls more tightly, accepting that their fate was no longer determined by courage or discipline, but by how long the sands of the desert allowed their pit to remain unmarked by fire. Viktor pressed his ear closer to the failing radio, as scattered fragments of transmission flickered through the static, each one carrying a different shade of fear that no amount of training could disguise. The voices came from crews who had survived the first barrage, their tones cracked and uneven as they struggled to comprehend what was happening beyond the limited visibility of their individual pits. Some swore they saw muzzle flashes from impossible distances, while others insisted the shots came from angles no Abrams should have been able to exploit. Every report contradicted the doctrine they had memorized, yet all of them pointed toward the same unsettling truth. The Americans were seeing them long before they could see anything at all. He listened as one frantic crew described spotting a faint shimmer drifting across the dunes just moments before their neighboring tank vanished under a pinpoint strike that left no time for reaction. Another voice, trembling with disbelief, claimed the thermal signature of their own engine might be betraying them to an enemy capable of reading the desert like a vast illuminated map. These fragments, though incomplete and chaotic, formed an emerging pattern that Viktor could no longer ignore, a pattern revealing that the Abrams was not adapting to their tactics, but instead operating on an entirely different plane of situational awareness. The gunner kept adjusting his optics in desperate attempts to validate these alarming claims, though every correction only deepened his frustration as the world beyond their pit remained an indecipherable haze. He finally muttered that perhaps the enemy was using sensor technology capable of filtering out terrain distortion, something their instructors had dismissed as science fiction during training lectures. Viktor recognized the quiet panic forming beneath the gunner's words, because the idea that their tanks could be identified purely by residual heat undermined every principle they believed governed armored warfare in the desert. Another transmission cut through the noise, this time from a surviving officer attempting to coordinate a counterfire effort based on triangulated estimates from the few operational crews. Yet even his authoritative tone faltered as he admitted that none of the calculations seemed to match the engagement ranges recorded in the shattered pits. The Abrams were striking faster than their observers could log coordinates, reducing any attempt at counterfire to little more than theoretical corrections on maps that no longer reflected the battlefield's shifting realities. The officer's voice eventually trailed off into silence, swallowed by static that suggested his tank had suffered the same fate as the others. Within the turret, the loader's breathing grew shallow as he pieced together the implications of the scattered reports, realizing they were fighting an enemy whose battlefield perception extended far beyond human limitations. The notion that the Abrams could detect the faint heat signature absorbed by the sand around their pits felt impossibly unfair, yet entirely consistent with the precision of the incoming fire. Each new report confirmed that concealment was meaningless, distance was irrelevant, and established doctrine offered no answers to an enemy guided by algorithms rather than line-of-sight intuition. Viktor could feel the atmosphere inside the tank tightening as each man absorbed the worsening truth, transforming the cramped turret into a crucible of dread and unwelcome understanding. Their line was not failing because of poor discipline or tactical errors. It was failing because every assumption they carried into this battle had been quietly invalidated by technology they were never taught to anticipate. Even if they escaped the pit, they realized the Abrams would detect their movement instantly, tracking the shifting thermal bloom of their engine like a flare against the cooling desert sand. The radio delivered one final, haunting transmission before falling silent once more, a shaken crew whispering that the Americans were adjusting fire with impossible speed, as if reading their reactions before they could fully commit to them. That message lingered in Viktor's thoughts, coiling around his mind with chilling clarity, because it confirmed the unspoken conclusion forming among the survivors. The Abrams were not merely outshooting them, they were predicting them, turning the battlefield into a lethal equation where the T-72 existed only as an input destined for elimination. As the static settled and the desert grew oppressively quiet, Viktor realized the discovery had completed its cruel loop. Knowledge had spread through the broken line not as a tool for survival, but as a final confirmation that their training, doctrine, and expectations had been rendered obsolete. The truth was painfully clear. They were fighting a war designed for an era that no longer existed, against a foe who had already mastered the future they failed to imagine. Far beyond the shattered defensive line, the American battalions continued advancing with calm precision, their movements synchronized through radio networks that updated position and range data in near real time. Each Abrams crew received continuous feedback from coordinated sensors, allowing them to adjust firing angles and target priorities as effortlessly as if they were following a rehearsed drill. While the T-72 crews struggled with distorted optics and unreliable communication, the Americans relied on a battlefield information system that transformed isolated tanks into interconnected nodes operating with collective awareness. As the Abrams formations pushed deeper into the desert, commanders quickly recognized that the Soviet-style pits, once considered formidable obstacles, were nothing more than static targets vulnerable to long-range thermal acquisition. They passed updated protocols advising crews to maintain extended standoff distances, ensuring engagements occurred well outside the reach of enemy optics. These recommendations spread through the ranks with remarkable speed, reinforcing new tactical habits that turned the battlefield into a proving ground for doctrines built entirely on precision and information superiority. Viktor listened to the distant hum of turbines as the Abrams repositioned yet again, realizing the Americans were not merely advancing, but methodically reshaping their entire approach based on the unfolding engagement. Their ability to adapt decisively stood in stark contrast to the rigid Soviet procedures that demanded crews follow established doctrine, even when evidence suggested its failure. Every adjustment made by the Americans, whether in formation spacing, targeting priority, or sensor interpretation, demonstrated an organizational flexibility that the T-72 battalions simply could not match under the constraints of their training. Back at the command post directing the American advance, staff officers analyzed real-time reports and used them to refine a growing catalog of tactical patterns. They noted how Soviet crews hesitated before firing, how pit positions limited turret depression, and how optical systems lagged when confronted with thermal mirage. Each observation became a data point that shaped the next firing instruction or maneuver command, creating a dynamic feedback loop that further widened the gap between both sides. Viktor understood that the Abrams was not acting alone. It operated within a network that amplified every advantage. Meanwhile, the Soviet-trained forces clung to increasingly outdated assumptions, unable to modify their strategy because their doctrine emphasized strict adherence rather than adaptive thinking. Their officers repeated the same range estimates and optical correction techniques, even though these methods had already proven useless against opponents who did not rely on visual cues. Viktor recognized the paralysis gripping the remaining crews, because no one possessed either the authority or the information necessary to propose meaningful changes under such rapidly shifting conditions. The disparity between both sides became painfully apparent as the Americans repositioned again, forming a broad arc designed to sweep the remaining pits with overlapping fields of fire. This maneuver exploited the T-72 seconds restricted mobility, forcing them to rotate turrets across angles their pits were never intended to accommodate. Viktor felt the stabilizer groan as the turret strained to track targets that constantly repositioned, revealing yet another systemic flaw in a defensive strategy built for predictable engagements. The Americans, however, avoided predictability entirely, using constant movement to deny the T-72 seconds any stable point of aim. The loader whispered that perhaps the Americans were not simply better equipped but fundamentally better organized, a suggestion Viktor reluctantly accepted as he observed the flawless coordination unfolding across the dunes. Unlike the fragmented Soviet-trained crews trapped in their pits, the Abrams battalions operated with shared intent, reacting instantly to new information and adjusting formations to maintain maximum advantage. Their cohesion turned each tank into an extension of a larger system, while the T-72 seconds remained isolated fragments of a doctrine that had failed to anticipate such fluid warfare. As the horizon filled with the steady advance of dust clouds stirred by the Abrams movement, Viktor understood that the Americans had transformed the engagement into a demonstration of systemic superiority rather than a contest of individual machines. The battle was no longer about armor, thickness, or penetration values. It had become a confrontation between two philosophies, one rooted in adaptability and information, the other trapped in rigid assumptions. In that moment, he realized the true battle had already been decided long before the first round was fired, because only one side had prepared for a world in which technology could rewrite every rule they once believed immutable. In the hours that followed the collapse of the defensive line, scattered reconnaissance teams began transmitting fragmented reports that inadvertently confirmed everything Viktor's instincts had already pieced together. Observers positioned far behind the front line described seeing Abrams rounds strike with uncanny consistency, each impact landing within narrow deviation bands that defied any expectation of long-range tank gunnery. These early accounts, compiled hastily under mounting confusion, indicated that the Americans were achieving first-shot hit probabilities previously considered theoretically possible but operationally improbable under real battlefield conditions. As more data emerged, analysts monitoring the engagement noted that the Abrams crews consistently fired from ranges exceeding the doctrinal limits outlined in Soviet manuals, contradicting decades of assumptions embedded within armored warfare training. They calculated that many of the destroyed T-72 seconds had been struck from distances well beyond 1,400 meters, a figure that exceeded the practical effectiveness of their optical systems by a margin too large to ignore. Viktor understood that these numbers, once verified, would rewrite the performance expectations for both sides, forcing a complete reassessment of what modern tanks could accomplish under pressure. Reports from aerial observers added another layer of clarity, revealing the distinct thermal trails emitted by buried T-72 positions as the early sunlight warmed the sand unevenly. The Abrams crews had exploited these thermal inconsistencies with remarkable precision, using sensor fusion to track even partial signatures that remained invisible to conventional optics. This evidence demonstrated that the Americans were not benefiting from isolated strokes of luck, but instead were executing repeatable, data-driven tactics built upon a technological foundation that treated the desert like a readable, responsive environment. Viktor knew that these findings would challenge long-held beliefs about the limitations imposed by environmental distortion, proving that accuracy was no longer governed solely by human judgment. Further analysis of the radio logs painted an equally sobering picture, illustrating how fragmented and reactive the Soviet-trained forces had become as their equipment and doctrine fell out of step with the realities of the battlefield. Messages showed repeated requests for visual confirmation before engagement, even as thermal-guided rounds zeroed in from distances far beyond the reach of their scopes. These transcripts highlighted a widening gap between theory and practice, demonstrating that their communication structure had been designed for a slower, more predictable style of warfare that no longer existed. Independent observers later reconstructed the engagement using layered data from radar sweeps, aerial footage, and battlefield telemetry, revealing a clear temporal pattern in which the Abrams consistently fired before the T-72 crews completed their first decisive targeting cycle. This timeline underscored the systemic nature of the collapse, showing how every defensive measure failed not because of poor execution, but because the enemy operated on a timeline shaped by faster detection, faster calculation, and faster reaction. The disparity in decision-making speed proved far more decisive than armor thickness or gun caliber. Viktor absorbed these conclusions with a heavy acceptance as he listened to the post-engagement summaries delivered through strained radio voices. Each report confirmed what the survivors had already felt so viscerally, that the desert provided no protection against an enemy capable of reading its temperature, measuring its contours, and exploiting its illusions. The data validated not just the Americans' superior technology, but also their mastery of integrating that technology into adaptable tactics. As Viktor stared across the battlefield now marked by smoke columns and shattered steel, he realized that the engagement would be studied for years, not as a simple clash of tanks, but as a turning point where information, precision, and adaptability overshadowed every assumption they once believed unbreakable. In the days that followed, analysts from multiple military districts gathered the remnants of the engagement into layered reports that would eventually redefine how future commanders interpreted armored warfare. They realized that the collapse of the defensive line had not simply resulted from the superiority of one machine over another, but from the systematic inability of an entire doctrine to recognize the changing nature of modern detection and engagement technologies. Viktor understood that the battlefield he had fought on was no longer just a desert filled with burning wrecks, but a stark demonstration of how quickly a theoretical advantage could evaporate when confronted with adversaries who embraced emerging capabilities. As reconstruction teams surveyed the shattered pits, they noted patterns that mirrored the conclusions already circulating among senior officers. Vehicles designed for frontal duels had been forced into static positions where their strengths were neutralized and their weaknesses amplified. The T-72s' limited gun depression, constrained turret rotation, and vulnerability to thermal exposure revealed structural shortcomings that traditional doctrine had either minimized or completely ignored during training. Viktor recognized that these limitations had always existed, yet they only became fatal when paired with opponents capable of exploiting them with mathematical precision. Throughout the command networks, discussions emerged about how the Americans had seamlessly integrated technology with adaptive tactics, demonstrating an organizational mindset that valued flexibility over strict procedural adherence. The Abrams battalions did not merely possess better sensors or computers. They possessed a culture willing to reinterpret battlefield conditions in real time, transforming technical advantages into coherent, decisive action. Viktor could not help but contrast this with the rigid structure he served under, where innovation was often perceived as deviation rather than potential improvement. As news of the engagement spread, military academies across several regions began quietly revising internal curricula, acknowledging that the era of relying solely on optical sightlines and static defensive planning had effectively ended. The new focus shifted toward environment-independent detection, sensor fusion targeting, and decentralized decision-making, a set of principles shaped directly by the devastating effectiveness of the Abrams during the confrontation. Viktor realized that the lessons extracted from the battlefield would influence not only future tank designs, but also the philosophical foundations of armor doctrine itself. Engineers reviewing the wreckage noted how the penetrations consistently aligned with angles optimized by predictive fire control algorithms, signaling a shift toward engagements governed less by intuition and more by computational certainty. This discovery prompted designers to reconsider long-held assumptions about survivability, mobility, and situational awareness, recognizing that modern threats demanded integrated systems capable of operating under conditions where human perception alone was insufficient. Viktor sensed that any future tank built without acknowledging these principles would be doomed to repeat the same fate as those buried in the sand around him. Strategists examining the broader implications concluded that the engagement represented a turning point where information dominance effectively overshadowed traditional measures of strength, such as armor, thickness, or crew discipline. The Abrams had demonstrated that a force capable of processing battlefield data faster could overwhelm adversaries, even when numerical or positional advantages favored the defense. Viktor understood that this realization would spark debates across entire military structures, challenging deeply rooted assumptions that had shaped decades of planning and procurement decisions. In the end, the legacy of the battle extended far beyond the charred remains of the T-72 seconds or the tactical maneuvers that led to their destruction. It influenced how nations perceived vulnerability, how commanders approached uncertainty, and how engineers defined the parameters of future armored vehicles. To Viktor, the battlefield became a harsh but undeniable teacher, one that revealed how quickly technological evolution